At 18, Ethan Mercer had $43, a duffel bag, and nobody in the world expecting him to survive. 3 weeks after aging out of foster care, he spent his last $10 on a rusted, abandoned fire station in a town he had never heard of. Everyone thought he was making the worst mistake of his life. But hidden behind a row of old steel lockers was a sealed room someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. Inside, Ethan would uncover the truth about 2 parents he had never known, a fire chief who had spent 18 years searching for him, and a legacy an entire town had been quietly protecting until the day he came home. The caseworker kept sliding the tissue box toward Ethan. She had done it 3 times already. Ethan never touched it. He sat in the plastic chair across from her desk while rain tapped softly against the office window. The folder in front of her looked thin, too thin. It contained everything the state knew about him, or everything the state cared enough to keep. "Do you have any questions?" Diane Mercer asked gently. Ethan looked at the folder. "That's it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "That's everything." Everything. 18 years, reduced to a folder thinner than a magazine. Ethan opened it. A birth certificate. No father listed. Mother, Abigail Mercer, deceased. 1 faded photograph of a toddler sitting on a kitchen floor. Hospital intake records. Placement transfers. 7 foster homes. 3 group homes. No explanations. No history. No family. Just dates. Names. Addresses. Endings. He stared at the picture for a long moment. The child in the photograph looked small and uncertain. One hand reached toward the edge of the frame, as if he had been trying to hold on to something before it disappeared. Diane slid a check across the desk. "Your remaining allowance balance, $43. Ethan folded the check and put it into his wallet. Then he placed the photograph behind it. The picture had been with him for years. It was the only proof he had ever belonged to someone. "Is there anywhere you can go?" Diane asked. "Yeah." The lie came easily. She knew it was a lie. He knew she knew. Neither said anything. 5 minutes later, Ethan walked out carrying everything he owned in a faded duffel bag. 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, a toothbrush, a phone charger, a paperback novel missing its cover. That was it. The first week was harder than he expected. Not because he was homeless, because he kept believing things would improve. He slept behind a grocery store the first night, under a highway bridge the second. By the 6th night, he had learned which security guards cared and which ones didn't. By the 2nd week, he had learned how long a loaf of bread could last if you stretched it carefully. By the 3rd week, his money was almost gone. His phone died. Then the charger broke. Without a phone, the world became smaller. Soup kitchens changed schedules. Libraries closed early. Information disappeared. The math stopped working. You couldn't eat and survive at the same time. One afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting at a truck stop 30 miles south of nowhere. A truck driver, drinking coffee, noticed him. Heading somewhere? Not really. The man studied him, then nodded toward his rig. "I'm driving west." That was all. No questions. No speeches, just an open passenger seat. Ethan climbed in. For 3 hours, they drove through rolling farmland and forgotten highways. The radio played old country songs. The trucker never asked Ethan's story. By sunset, they reached a small town. A weathered sign stood beside the road. Pine Hollow Ridge, population 4,127. The truck stopped at an intersection. "This is where I turn off." Ethan grabbed his bag. "Thanks." The trucker nodded once and drove away. Ethan stood alone on the sidewalk. Ahead of him stretched a quiet main street lined with old brick buildings. A diner, a hardware store, a courthouse, a place that looked like it belonged in another decade. As he passed the courthouse, something taped to a bulletin board caught his attention. A flyer. County tax auction Saturday, 10 a.m. 12 properties listed. Most were empty lots, condemned houses, abandoned sheds. Then Ethan saw the final listing. Former Station 7 firehouse, minimum bid, 10. He stopped walking. Read it once, then again. And for reasons he could not explain, He couldn't stop staring at it, because $10 was one of the few things he still had, and somehow that frightened him more than having nothing at all. Ethan spent Friday night beneath the awning of a closed gas station on the edge of Pine Hollow Ridge. Rain drummed softly on the metal roof above him. The flyer from the courthouse was folded in his pocket. He had read it so many times that the paper was beginning to soften at the creases. Former Station 7 firehouse. Minimum bid, $10. $10! The number seemed ridiculous. $10 would leave him with almost nothing. $9 and a building he couldn't heat. $9 and a building he couldn't sell. $9 and a roof that might collapse on him while he slept. Every calculation ended the same way. Buying the fire station was a terrible idea. By sunrise, he had decided to do it anyway. The courthouse lawn was already crowded when he arrived. Rows of folding chairs faced a temporary podium. Most of the people looked local: farmers, retirees, business owners, people who greeted each other by first name, people who belonged somewhere. Ethan sat alone in the back row. The county clerk stepped to the microphone and began reading property descriptions. One by one, the lots sold. An empty parcel on the edge of town, a condemned farmhouse, a storage building with a collapsed roof. The bidders barely hesitated. Paddles rose. Numbers climbed. Sales were completed within seconds. Ethan watched quietly. His $10 bill remained folded in his pocket. Eventually, the clerk reached the final listing. Property 12, former Station 7 firehouse. Single-story brick structure, approximately 4,000 square feet. Decommissioned in 2018. Structural deterioration noted. Water damage present. Minimum bid $10. Silence. Nobody moved. The clerk waited. "Do I have $10? Still nothing. A woman in the front row glanced toward the fire station's address on her paperwork and shook her head. Someone behind Ethan laughed quietly. The clerk cleared his throat. "Do I have $10? Ethan raised his hand. Every head turned. The silence became heavier. For a moment, he wondered if he had done something wrong. Then the clerk nodded. $10 from the young man. He looked around. "Do I hear 15? Nothing. The crowd remained perfectly still. 15? No response. The clerk waited another few seconds, then raised the gavel. Sold. The sound echoed across the lawn. Just like that, Ethan owned an abandoned fire station. Nobody applauded. Nobody congratulated him. People simply gathered their papers and began leaving. A woman near the aisle paused beside him. "You bought Station 7? Ethan nodded. The woman frowned. "Good luck." She sounded sincere, which somehow felt worse. Inside the courthouse, Ethan signed paperwork he barely understood. The county clerk handed him a plain metal key attached to a faded tag. Station 7. She watched him place it carefully into his pocket. "You know what you're getting into?" "No." The answer slipped out before he could stop it. To his surprise, the clerk smiled. "Then you're probably the right person for it." 20 minutes later, Ethan stood in front of the property. Station 7 sat 3 blocks from Main Street. The brick walls were stained by years of weather. 2 large bay doors faced the street. Both hung crooked on rusted tracks. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete pad. Several windows were broken. The place looked forgotten, almost erased. Ethan walked slowly toward the nearest bay door. The metal groaned as he ducked underneath. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp concrete. Sunlight filtered through broken windows. The truck bay stretched across most of the building. Oil stains marked the floor. Pieces of ceiling tile littered the ground. Water pooled near a clogged drain. But beneath the damage, Ethan noticed something important. The building was still standing. The steel beams overhead were solid. The brick walls were straight. The concrete floor was level. This wasn't a dead building. It was an abandoned one. There was a difference. He spent the afternoon cleaning. Broken glass went into piles. Collapsed ceiling tiles were dragged outside. Mud and debris disappeared beneath an old push broom he found in a utility closet. Hours passed. Slowly, a clean square of concrete appeared near the back wall. By evening, he unrolled his sleeping bag. The station felt strangely quiet. No traffic, no shouting, no one telling him he couldn't stay. For the first time in weeks, he had a roof above his head. As darkness settled, Ethan explored the rear hallway. A bunk room, a kitchen, a bathroom stripped of fixtures. Then, at the very back of the station, he found 6 red steel lockers bolted tightly against a wall. Something about them felt wrong. The lockers looked newer than everything around them, and the wall behind them wasn't brick. It was gray cinder block, different, out of place. Ethan stepped closer. Then he felt it, a faint stream of cold air brushing against his ankle. He knelt and looked beneath the final locker. A narrow gap separated the wall from the floor. Cool air flowed steadily through it, as if an empty space existed on the other side. Ethan stared into the darkness beneath the locker. Somewhere behind that wall, something was waiting, and someone had worked very hard to keep it hidden. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought about the cold air flowing from beneath the lockers. A building that had been abandoned for years should not be breathing. Yet that was exactly what it felt like. Something existed behind that wall, something sealed away. When morning arrived, pale sunlight filtered through the broken windows of Station 7. Ethan was already standing in the locker room. The 6 red lockers stretched across the cinder block wall like silent guards. He opened each one again. Dust, wire hangers, an old pair of rubber boots. Nothing else. No clues, no explanation. He pressed his hand against the cinder blocks. Cold, much colder than the surrounding brick walls. Then he knocked. Solid, solid, solid. Near the far left side, the sound changed. Hollow. His pulse quickened. There was definitely empty space behind the wall. The problem was obvious. The lockers weren't meant to be moved. Heavy steel brackets bolted them directly into the concrete floor. The entire row had been welded together. Whoever installed them had wanted the wall hidden permanently. Ethan grabbed the end locker and pulled. Nothing. He braced his foot against the wall and tried again. The locker didn't move an inch. He needed tools. Real tools. An hour later, he crossed Main Street and pushed open the door of the hardware store. A bell rang overhead. The store smelled like sawdust and machine oil. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Every inch seemed packed with tools, paint cans, bolts, and equipment. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s. Gray hair, work shirt, reading glasses pushed onto his forehead. The man looked up. "Help you?" "I need a socket wrench," Ethan said, "and maybe a pry bar." The man studied him for several seconds. "What are you working on?" "The old fire station." Recognition immediately crossed the man's face. "So you're the kid who bought Station 7. Word travels fast," the man chuckled. "In a town this size, everything travels fast." He came around the counter. "Name's Samuel Bishop." "Ethan Mercer." Samuel led him toward the tool aisle. He picked up a socket set and handed it over. "This should handle most of the bolts." Ethan checked the price tag. $24. His stomach sank. "I only have 9. Samuel looked at him, then looked through the front window toward the station. For a moment, he seemed to be remembering something. Finally, he shrugged. "Take it." Ethan blinked. "What?" "Bring it back when you're done. I can't promise when that'll be." "Didn't ask you to." Samuel turned away. On the way back to the counter, he stopped beside a small refrigerator. He pulled out a paper bag and placed it beside the tool case. "What's that?" "Lunch." "I can't pay for that either." Samuel slid the bag across the counter. "Good thing I wasn't selling it." Inside was a ham sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. Ethan stared at it. The simple kindness felt almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to receiving things without conditions attached. "Thank you." Samuel waved him away. "Just bring back the tools." Back at the station, Ethan ate the sandwich sitting on the concrete pad. Then he got to work. The bolts were rusted solid. The first one took nearly 20 minutes. His knuckles scraped against steel. Sweat ran down his back. But eventually the bolt turned. Then another. Then another. Hours passed. One locker came loose, then a second, then a third. The sound of steel scraping across concrete echoed through the building. By mid-afternoon, the entire row had been moved aside. The wall stood exposed, and now Ethan could see what the lockers had been hiding. A door. Heavy steel, painted red years ago, now covered in rust. Faded white lettering remained barely visible across the center. Ethan stepped closer. The handle was locked. The key from the courthouse didn't fit. He stared at the door for a long moment, then slid the pry bar into the gap beside the frame. The metal groaned. He pulled harder. Nothing. He adjusted his grip and tried again. The frame creaked. Dust fell from the cinder blocks. One more pull. A loud crack echoed through the station. The lock snapped. The door swung inward. A rush of cool air washed over him. Air that smelled faintly of paper, dust, and time. Ethan stepped through the doorway. The room beyond looked untouched. A desk sat against the far wall. 2 filing cabinets stood beside it. Photographs covered the walls. A calendar still hung where someone had left it years earlier. Dust coated every surface, but there was no water damage, no mold, no decay. The room had been preserved, waiting. At the center of the desk lay a leather-bound journal. Ethan walked forward slowly. The cover was cracked with age. Stamped into the leather were 2 words: Walter Holloway, Fire Chief. Ethan sat down in the old chair. The room was silent. Then he opened the journal to the first page, and immediately realized someone had been leaving a message behind. Ethan lost track of time the moment he opened Walter Holloway's journal. The handwriting was neat, careful. The kind of handwriting produced by someone who believed details mattered. The first entries seemed ordinary. Equipment inventories, training schedules, maintenance records, notes about fire inspections and emergency calls. Walter had documented everything, page after page, year after year. Ethan flipped through dozens of entries. At first, he wasn't sure why someone would hide a room just to protect old paperwork. Then he noticed something. Certain pages were marked with a small star drawn in the margin. The starred entries were different. Walter wasn't writing about fire trucks or inspections. He was recording acts of kindness. March 12, $300 to a family displaced by a house fire. Insurance claim denied. Fund balance updated. June 4. $200 for emergency medical expenses. Recipient requested anonymity. December 21. $500 for a widow struggling to pay heating bills. Fund approved. The entries continued for years. Dozens. Hundreds. Walter referred to the money simply as the fund. Always capitalized. Always important. Ethan leaned back in the chair. The amounts weren't huge. $50, $100, $300. But over and over, Walter had quietly helped people survive difficult moments. No publicity, no recognition, no credit, just help. The deeper Ethan read, the more he understood. Station 7 had been more than a fire station. It had been the heart of the town, a place where people looked after one another. Hours passed. Dust floated through the sunlight coming from the small office window. Then Ethan reached an entry that made him stop. 2 names appeared in the middle of a page. Nathan Mercer, Abigail Mercer. His eyes narrowed. The names felt familiar. It took him several seconds to understand why. Mercer, his own last name. He read the entry again. Nathan Mercer repaired the East Bay door today, refused payment as usual. Abigail Mercer volunteered an extra shift after working 12 hours at the clinic. Best people this station has ever had. Ethan sat perfectly still. The next few pages mentioned them again and again. Walter admired them. That much was obvious. Nathan was described as a carpenter, Abigail as a nurse. Both served as volunteer firefighters. The journal painted a picture of 2 people who worked hard and never expected praise. People Walter trusted completely. Ethan turned another page, then another. The tone changed. The handwriting became tighter, less steady. October 14, 2006. The date appeared at the top of a page. Below it were only 2 sentences. 14 children survived. Nathan and Abigail did not. Ethan stared at the words. A strange heaviness settled in his chest. He didn't know these people. At least, he didn't think he did. Yet the names pulled at something deep inside him. The pages that followed became increasingly personal. Walter wrote about grief, about loss, about a child, a baby boy, 6 months old, no family available, placed into state custody. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He kept reading. Months passed in the journal. Then, years. Walter never stopped mentioning the child. Called the county again today. No information released. Privacy laws. Wrote another letter. No response. Hired an investigator. Nothing. The entries stretched across nearly 2 decades. Walter had spent 18 years searching for someone. The frustration became visible in the ink. The pen strokes grew heavier. Some words carved grooves into the paper. But Walter never gave up, never stopped looking. Finally, Ethan reached the last completed entry. The date was only weeks before Walter's death. The writing was slower than before, careful, deliberate, as though Walter knew it would be the final thing he ever recorded. Ethan read the words quietly. I've done everything I can. If the boy ever comes looking, everything is here. The boy. Ethan closed the journal. The room suddenly felt smaller. The photographs on the walls seemed to be watching him. Who was the boy? Why had Walter spent 18 years searching for him? And why did Nathan and Abigail Mercer keep appearing throughout the journal? Questions circled endlessly in Ethan's mind. Eventually, he stood and left the office. The late afternoon sun was beginning to sink behind the buildings outside. Across the street, Samuel Bishop was stacking boxes near the entrance of his hardware store. Ethan crossed the road. Samuel looked up immediately. One glance at Ethan's face told him something had changed. You found the office, Samuel said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. You knew it was there. Everybody knew Walter had a room hidden back there. Samuel set down the box he was carrying. Nobody knew how to get inside after he sealed it up. Ethan hesitated, then spoke the names. Nathan Mercer. Samuel froze. The reaction lasted less than a second, but Ethan saw it. The recognition, the sadness, the memory. You knew them. Samuel slowly removed his glasses. Yeah, he said quietly. I knew them. Ethan's pulse quickened. Who were they? Samuel looked toward Station 7. Toward the building standing silent across the street. Then he looked back at Ethan. Nathan and Abigail Mercer were volunteer firefighters. He paused. And they had a baby boy. Ethan felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. Samuel's voice softened. When they died, that little boy disappeared into foster care. The street suddenly seemed very quiet. And for the first time since opening the journal, Ethan was afraid of what he might discover next. Ethan didn't remember crossing the street. One moment he was standing inside Samuel Bishop's hardware store. The next he was back inside the hidden office beneath Station 7. The words repeated endlessly inside his head. They had a baby boy who disappeared into foster care. His hands felt strangely numb. He sat in Walter Holloway's chair and stared at the filing cabinets beside the desk. There was only one way to know the truth. He opened the first drawer. Equipment records, payroll forms, inspection reports, nothing useful. The second drawer contained correspondence, permits, tax documents, insurance paperwork. For nearly 20 minutes he searched through folders and yellowing files. Then he found it. A manila folder tucked into the very back corner. The tab contained a handwritten label. Mercer family. Urgent. Ethan stopped breathing. The handwriting matched Walter's journal. Careful, precise, personal. For several seconds he simply stared at the folder. Then he opened it. Inside were 3 items. Nothing more, nothing less. The first was a photograph. A newborn baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. The infant lay inside a bassinet with a card attached to the side. Baby Boy Mercer. The date beneath the name read March 2006. Ethan studied the tiny face. The baby looked impossibly small. Red cheeks, closed eyes, tiny clenched fists. Without thinking, he reached into his wallet. He pulled out the old photograph from his foster care file. The toddler sitting on a kitchen floor, one hand reaching toward the edge of the picture. Ethan placed both photographs side by side. His heart pounded. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same ears, the same nose, the same shape around the eyes. The baby in Walter's folder was him. He knew it before seeing any official proof. The second item was a newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age. The headline stretched across the page. 2 volunteer firefighters killed saving children in school fire. Below the headline sat a photograph of a burning building. Smoke poured from shattered windows. Firefighters crowded the lawn. Emergency vehicles filled the street. Underneath were 2 smaller photographs. A man, a woman, Nathan Mercer, Abigail Mercer. Ethan stared at their faces. His father, his mother. For 18 years they had existed only as blank spaces on a birth certificate. Now they were real. Nathan had strong features and kind eyes. Abigail's expression carried a calm confidence that seemed impossible to fake. Neither looked like strangers, and that frightened Ethan more than anything else, because some part of him recognized them. Not from memory, from belonging. The article described the fire. A blaze at Cedar Grove Elementary School. 14 children trapped on the 2nd floor. Nathan and Abigail were the first volunteers through the doors. They carried children to safety through classroom windows, one after another. 14 survived. Neither firefighter escaped. Ethan's throat tightened. He kept reading. Then he found the sentence. Survived by their 6-month-old son, Ethan Nathaniel Mercer. The room became completely silent. Even the dust floating through the sunlight seemed frozen. Ethan Nathaniel Mercer, his full name. The same name printed on his birth certificate. The same name the state had handed him 3 weeks earlier. The final item inside the folder was another photograph, larger than the others. Nathan and Abigail stood together in front of Station 7. Both wore volunteer firefighter gear. Nathan's arm rested around Abigail's shoulder. They looked happy, comfortable, certain of their place in the world. On the back, Walter had written, Nathan and Abigail Mercer, Station 7 Volunteers, September 2005. Ethan turned the picture over and stared at it. Then he held it beside the old toddler photograph. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Nathan's eyes, Abigail's jawline, both staring back at him from his own reflection. His hands trembled, not because he was afraid, because for the first time in his life, he knew where he came from. He wasn't abandoned. He wasn't unwanted. His parents hadn't disappeared. They had died saving children. 14 children. 14 families, people who got to go home because Nathan and Abigail never did. The realization hit him harder than anything else. Every foster home, every move, every lonely birthday, every unanswered question, all of it had begun with one terrible day in 2006. Ethan sat in Walter's chair for a long time. The photographs spread across the desk. The newborn picture, the newspaper clipping, his parents standing proudly outside Station 7, and his old toddler photograph from foster care. 4 pieces of paper, an entire life. Eventually, darkness began filling the room. The sunlight faded from gold to orange, then to gray. A soft knock sounded against the open office door. Samuel stood there. Neither man spoke immediately. Samuel looked at the photographs, then nodded quietly. You found them. Ethan swallowed. Yeah. Samuel stepped into the room. His eyes settled on Nathan and Abigail's picture. A sad smile crossed his face. They were good people. Ethan looked up. You really knew them? I knew them well. Samuel paused, then added softly, if you want the rest of the story, there's someone you need to meet. Who? Samuel looked toward the dark hallway beyond the office. Walter Holloway's widow. He hesitated. Her name is Evelyn. The silence stretched between them. Then Samuel spoke the words that made Ethan's pulse quicken again. "She's been waiting 18 years for you to come home." Ethan spent most of the night awake. The photographs remained spread across Walter Holloway's desk. Every time he looked at them, the truth felt more real. Nathan Mercer, Abigail Mercer, his parents. For 18 years, they had been names on a document. Now they had faces, stories, lives, and somehow that made their absence feel heavier. Morning arrived, gray and cool. Ethan washed his face in the station's bathroom sink, though the water still didn't work. Instead, he used bottled water and a rag. Then he put the photographs carefully back into the Mercer family folder. By 8 o'clock, he was standing outside a small white house 3 blocks from Station 7. A narrow walkway led through an overgrown garden. Rose bushes lined the fence. A wind chime hung from the porch roof. The house looked quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after years of waiting. Ethan climbed the steps and knocked. Nothing happened. He waited. Then he heard movement inside. Slow footsteps. Careful footsteps. The door opened a few inches. An elderly woman looked out. White hair, blue eyes, thin frame. She studied him through wire-rimmed glasses. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then her hand tightened around the edge of the door. Her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness!" The words escaped like a breath. Ethan opened his mouth. "My name is Ethan. I know who you are." The woman interrupted softly. Tears immediately appeared in her eyes. "You have Nathan's eyes." The sentence hit Ethan harder than he expected. The woman stared at him as though she were seeing a ghost, or perhaps someone she had spent years imagining. "Evelyn Holloway?" Ethan asked. She nodded, then stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled faintly of tea and old books. Photographs covered nearly every wall. Firefighters, community events, family gatherings, pieces of a life collected over decades. Evelyn led him into a small kitchen. A kettle sat on the stove. Without asking, she filled it with water and turned on the burner. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from age. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, she sat across from him at the table. Her eyes never left his face. Walter had described this moment hundreds of times. Ethan looked up. "He thought I'd come back?" Evelyn smiled sadly. He never doubted it. The kettle began to whistle. She rose slowly and poured tea into 2 mugs. When she returned, she wrapped both hands around hers. "He spent 18 years searching for you." Samuel had already told Ethan that much, but hearing it from Evelyn felt different, more personal. "He called state agencies," she continued. "He wrote letters, hired investigators, traveled to county offices. Every lead ended the same way. No information available." Ethan nodded. The foster system protected records. He knew that. Walter never had a chance. "He never stopped trying," Evelyn said quietly. "Not once." Silence settled between them. Eventually, Ethan pulled the photograph of Nathan and Abigail from the folder. Evelyn's expression softened immediately. "Oh." She reached for the picture carefully. "I haven't seen this one in years." Her fingers traced the edge of the photograph. They met at Station 7. Ethan listened. Nathan was a carpenter. A smile appeared. "The most stubborn man I've ever known." She laughed softly. If a wall was crooked by half an inch, he'd tear it apart and rebuild it. Ethan found himself smiling. The image felt easy to picture. "And Abigail?" Evelyn's eyes brightened. She was a nurse at the clinic. Her voice carried obvious affection. Quiet, smart, brave. The smile faded. But when emergencies happened, everyone followed her. She looked at Ethan. People trusted Abigail. Ethan studied the photograph again. His mother looked confident, strong, exactly as Evelyn described. They loved each other very much. Evelyn took a sip of tea. The station became their second home. She pointed toward the window. Most weekends they were there, repairing things, training, helping with fundraisers. Then I came along. Evelyn nodded. You came along. For the first time that morning, genuine warmth appeared in her smile. Abigail carried photographs of you everywhere. Ethan froze. What? Everywhere. The answer came immediately. She showed everyone pictures of you. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. Evelyn continued. She brought you to the station in a car seat when you were a baby. A small laugh escaped her. Walter used to pretend he needed help with paperwork just so he could hold you for a few minutes. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too full. Ethan stared into his tea, trying to imagine people loving him before he could remember, trying to imagine belonging somewhere. Eventually, he asked the question he had been avoiding. What happened that day? Evelyn's smile disappeared. The room became quiet. Only the ticking of a wall clock remained. The school fire. Ethan nodded. Evelyn looked toward the window, as if she were seeing something far away. It happened fast. Her voice lowered. Cedar Grove Elementary. Electrical fire in the basement. She swallowed. 14 children trapped upstairs. Ethan's chest tightened. Your parents were the first through the door. The clock continued ticking. They got every child out. Every word sounded deliberate, careful, painfully remembered. Then Evelyn looked directly at him, and after they were gone, Walter made a promise. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. What promise? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. He promised that if he couldn't save your parents, she paused, he would spend the rest of his life trying to find their son. The room fell silent. Then, after a long moment, Evelyn spoke again. There is something else Walter left behind. Ethan looked up. Her gaze drifted toward Station 7 in the distance. Something important remains hidden there. Something Walter protected until the day he died. And according to him, it belongs to you. Ethan and Evelyn returned to Station 7 that afternoon. Neither spoke much during the walk. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt full of memories, full of people who should have been there, but weren't. When they reached the station, sunlight streamed through the truck bay windows and stretched long shadows across the concrete floor. Evelyn moved slowly through the building. Her cane tapped softly against the floor. She paused several times, running her fingers along the brick walls, touching old door frames, stopping at photographs Ethan had discovered inside Walter's office. This place hasn't changed as much as I thought, she said quietly. It changed enough. Ethan glanced around the station, the broken windows, the cracked paint, the water stains. Evelyn smiled. That's not what I mean. They eventually reached the hidden office. The room felt different now, less like a mystery, more like a shrine. Photographs of firefighters covered the walls. Walter's journal remained open on the desk. The Mercer family folder sat exactly where Ethan had left it. Evelyn stepped behind the desk, then pointed downward. There. Ethan followed her gaze. A gray metal safe sat bolted beneath the desk. He had noticed it before, but he had never found a way to open it. No combination dial, no handle, only a small brass keyhole. Walter mentioned it in the journal once or twice. Nothing more. Evelyn reached beneath her sweater. A thin silver chain emerged. Something hung from it. A key. Small, brass, worn smooth with age. Ethan stared. Evelyn slowly removed the chain from around her neck. Walter gave this to me 3 weeks before he died. The room felt suddenly still. He told me to keep it safe. She held the key in her palm. Until the boy came. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then she extended her hand. The brass key rested in the center of her palm. Waiting. Ethan took it carefully. The metal felt surprisingly warm, as though it had absorbed years of waiting. Evelyn sat down in the chair across from the desk. Her eyes glistened. He believed this day would happen. Ethan swallowed hard, then knelt beside the safe. The key slid into the lock effortlessly. For a moment he hesitated. 18 years. Everything seemed to come back to that number. 18 years of searching. 18 years of waiting. 18 years of not knowing. Then he turned the key. A sharp click echoed inside the office. The lock released. Slowly, Ethan opened the door. Inside were 3 items. Nothing more. Nothing less. a leather document folder, a thick manila envelope, and a sealed white envelope. Across the front of the white envelope, written in Walter's careful handwriting, were 2 words. Ethan Mercer. His breath caught. Evelyn covered her mouth with one hand. Walter had written to him, years before they ever met, years before anyone knew whether Ethan would find the station. Ethan carefully removed the leather folder first. Inside was a property deed. He unfolded the papers. The date surprised him. Walter had purchased Station 7 12 years earlier. Not recently. Not before he died, 12 years ago. Ethan read every line. Walter Holloway had paid $22,000 of his own money to purchase the property from the county. Station 7 had never been abandoned. Not really. Walter owned it outright. But that wasn't the most surprising part. At the bottom of the final page sat a notarized trust agreement. The beneficiary's name was clearly printed. Ethan Nathaniel Mercer. His heart began pounding. He read it again, then again. The station wasn't simply a building Walter had protected. It had been preserved specifically for him. The realization left him speechless. Evelyn wiped tears from her eyes. He always said the station would find you. Ethan carefully set the deed aside, then opened the manila envelope. Inside were dozens of financial documents, bank statements, contribution records, trust agreements. The title printed across the first page read, Station 7, Community Fund, Designated Beneficiary, Ethan Nathaniel Mercer. His pulse quickened. He turned to the latest statement. The date was 8 years old. The balance made him stop breathing. $327,418.22. The number seemed impossible. For several seconds he thought he had read it wrong. Then he checked again. $327,000. The room blurred slightly. Ethan had spent the last month worrying about food, about shelter, about surviving another week. Now he was staring at a number larger than anything he had ever imagined possessing. Evelyn nodded slowly. Walter told me it would be enough to help you start your life. Ethan looked through the records. The deposits were small. $20, $50, $100. Community fundraisers, pancake breakfasts, car washes, charity events. Thousands of small acts of generosity accumulated over decades. People had contributed because they believed in Station 7, because they believed in Nathan and Abigail, because they believed in a little boy they had never met. The weight of it settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders. Finally, only one item remained. The white envelope. Walter's letter. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. He wrote that shortly before he died. Ethan picked up the envelope. His name stared back at him from the faded paper. The handwriting looked steady, intentional, like Walter had taken his time, preparing for this exact moment. Slowly, Ethan broke the seal and unfolded the first page. The opening line immediately brought tears to Evelyn's eyes, because Walter had begun with the words he had waited 18 years to say. Dear Ethan. Ethan stared at the first line of Walter Holloway's letter for a long moment before continuing. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Across the desk, Evelyn sat quietly. Tears already filled her eyes. The room seemed smaller now, filled with memories, filled with promises, filled with 18 years of waiting. Ethan took a breath and began reading aloud. Dear Ethan, I don't know how old you'll be when you read this. I don't know what kind of man you've become. Truthfully, I don't even know if you'll ever find this room. But if you're reading these words, then Station 7 found you. Evelyn lowered her head. A soft sob escaped her. Ethan continued, Your parents were two of the finest people I have ever known. Nathan Mercer could build anything. Abigail Mercer could calm anyone. Together, they made this station stronger than any piece of equipment we ever owned. Ethan paused. His throat tightened. Then he read on. When you were born, your father carried photographs of you in his wallet and showed them to anyone who would stand still long enough to look. Your mother brought you to training sessions and sat you on my desk while she worked. You were loved from the moment you entered this world. The words hit harder than Ethan expected. For years he had wondered whether anyone had wanted him, whether anyone had cared. Walter's letter erased those doubts with every sentence. He continued reading. Your parents died the way they lived, putting others before themselves. They saved 14 children that day. Never forget that. Ethan looked at the photographs spread across the desk. Nathan, Abigail, heroes, not strangers. His parents. He continued. After they died, I tried to find you. I called counties, states, agencies. I hired investigators. I followed every lead I could find. I failed every time. For that, I am sorry. Evelyn wiped tears from her cheeks. You never failed, she whispered. Ethan swallowed and continued. The fund belongs to you now. Not because of charity, not because of pity, because every firefighter who contributed believed your parents earned it through the lives they lived. Every donation was given willingly. Every dollar was invested in the hope that someday you would come home. The room fell silent after he finished the final paragraph. Neither Ethan nor Evelyn spoke for several moments. Finally, he folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the photographs. Walter's voice still seemed present in the room, as if he had only stepped away moments earlier. The next morning, Ethan walked to Heritage Valley Bank carrying the trust documents. The bank manager spent nearly 30 minutes reviewing paperwork. Phone calls were made, records verified, signatures confirmed. Finally, the manager looked up and smiled. The trust is valid. Ethan felt his chest loosen. The balance currently stands at $327,612. Hearing the number spoken aloud felt unreal. The manager handed him access paperwork. For the first time in his life, Ethan had options, a future, a foundation, something no foster placement had ever given him. When he returned to Station 7, a black SUV sat parked outside. A man stood beside it. Expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive shoes that looked completely out of place on the cracked concrete. The man smiled politely. Mr. Mercer? Ethan nodded. I'm Graham Whitlock. The name meant nothing. I own Whitlock Development. That explained the SUV. Graham looked at the station, then back at Ethan. I've been trying to acquire this property for several years. Ethan already disliked where the conversation was heading. The station isn't for sale. Graham smiled again. The smile never reached his eyes. Everything has a price. No. For the first time, Graham's expression shifted. Slightly. You should think carefully. I have. Graham folded his arms. There may be legal complications involving the auction. Ethan remained calm. What kind of complications? The county may not have had clear authority to transfer ownership. The words sounded rehearsed, prepared, as though Graham had delivered them before. Ethan walked inside without answering. Several moments later, he returned carrying Walter's deed, the trust documents, and the bank paperwork. He handed everything over. Graham read quietly. The confidence slowly disappeared from his face. Page after page, signature after signature, notary seal after notary seal. The silence stretched. Finally, Graham lowered the documents. This is legitimate. It is. The developer looked at the station again, but this time his expression had changed. Confusion replaced certainty. Then Ethan remembered something from the contribution records. He walked back into the office, returned with another folder, and opened it on the hood of Graham's SUV. Rows of handwritten entries filled the pages. Names, dates, donations. 40 years of generosity. Ethan pointed to one entry, then another, and another. The color drained from Graham's face, because the same name appeared repeatedly. Robert Whitlock, his father. Monthly donations, year after year, page after page. Graham stared at the records. What is this? The Station 7 Community Fund. Ethan turned several pages, then stopped. A second entry sat near the bottom. College tuition assistance. Recipient, Graham Whitlock. Approved by Walter Holloway. The developer went completely still. For several seconds, he didn't speak, didn't move. didn't blink. Then he whispered, "I didn't know." Ethan believed him. Walter had never wanted credit. That had been the entire point. The silence lingered between them. Finally, Graham looked up at the station, not as a piece of real estate, not as a development opportunity, but as something else, something older, something bigger, a place that had quietly changed lives for decades, including his own. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow Ridge, Ethan realized that saving Station 7 might not be his only responsibility. He might have to rebuild its legacy, too. The following Saturday, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot of Station 7. Ethan was replacing broken window glass when he heard the engine. He glanced up. The driver stepped out. Graham Whitlock. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Graham walked to the back of the truck and lowered the tailgate. The bed was filled with lumber, stacks of fresh 2x4s, plywood sheets, boxes of construction screws, enough materials to complete several major repairs. Graham shrugged awkwardly. "My father would have been angry if I didn't bring this." Ethan couldn't help smiling. "Then we'd better not disappoint him." For the next hour, they unloaded lumber in silence. No contracts, no negotiations, no speeches, just work. When the final board had been stacked against the wall, Graham climbed back into his truck. "You need anything else?" Ethan thought about it. "Yeah." "What?" "Keep showing up." Graham smiled. For the first time, it looked genuine. Then he drove away. The next week, he returned with drywall. The week after that, paint. After that, insulation. Every Saturday, he arrived with something useful. And every Saturday, he left before anyone could thank him properly. Word spread quickly through Pine Hollow Ridge. The story of Station 7 moved from porch conversations to diner booths and church gatherings. People began talking about Walter Holloway, about the community fund, about Nathan and Abigail Mercer, about the boy who had unknowingly come home. One morning, a retired electrician appeared carrying a toolbox. "I heard your wiring is a disaster." It wasn't a question. By lunchtime, he was replacing old circuits. 2 days later, a plumber arrived. The following week, a roofer. Nobody asked for payment. Nobody wanted recognition. They simply worked. The same way Walter had helped people for decades. Quietly, without keeping score. By early spring, the station was changing. The truck bay was clean. The broken windows were gone. Fresh glass reflected sunlight across the concrete floor. Water flowed through the pipes again. Electricity returned. The first night the lights came on, Ethan stood in the center of the truck bay and simply stared. Rows of fluorescent fixtures flickered to life overhead. The building glowed. For the first time in years, Station 7 looked alive. Samuel Bishop stood beside him, hands in his pockets, a proud smile on his face. Nathan would have loved this. The words carried more meaning than Ethan knew how to answer, so he simply nodded. A few weeks later, Ethan began work on a small apartment in the rear section of the station. The space had once been used for storage. Now he framed walls, installed flooring, painted drywall, built cabinets. Slowly, a home emerged. When it was finished, he invited Evelyn to see it. She stood quietly inside the doorway. A small kitchen, a comfortable bedroom, a bathroom with new fixtures. Sunlight streamed through a newly installed window. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "You built this?" Ethan nodded. "Mostly." She looked around, running her hand along the countertop, touching the fresh paint. Then she smiled. Walter would have approved. "Will you move in?" Evelyn looked at him, surprised. "Here?" "Your family." The answer came naturally. Without hesitation, the old woman pressed her lips together, trying not to cry. Then she laughed softly. "Well," she glanced around the apartment again, "I suppose I'd better start packing." 3 days later, Evelyn moved into Station 7. The building felt different immediately. Warmer, less lonely, like a home instead of a project. Meanwhile, Ethan enrolled in community college courses online: business management, structural engineering, construction planning. Every morning he studied at Walter's old desk. Every afternoon he worked on the station. For the first time in his life, the future felt real. not something happening to him, something he was building. One evening, while reviewing the fund documents again, Ethan made a decision. The money Walter had protected wasn't meant to sit untouched. That wasn't the point. The point was helping people, the same way Walter had, the same way Nathan and Abigail had. Within weeks, paperwork was filed. The Harold Holloway Community Fund officially opened. The mission remained simple: help people before they fall too far. No publicity, no headlines, just help. The first grant went to a single mother whose furnace failed during winter. $700. Enough to replace it. Ethan signed the check sitting at Walter's desk. For a moment, he imagined the old chief standing nearby, watching, approving. Outside, spring arrived in Pine Hollow Ridge. Flowers appeared along Main Street, trees filled with green leaves, and people began visiting Station 7 for a different reason. Not because it was abandoned, not because it was mysterious, because it mattered. One afternoon, Samuel stood beside Ethan in the truck bay, watching volunteers paint a wall. You realize this isn't just a fire station anymore. Ethan looked around at the people working, laughing, helping, belonging. No, he said quietly. It's something bigger. Samuel nodded. Then you'd better get ready. Ready for what? The older man smiled. The reopening. Ethan frowned. What reopening? Samuel laughed. The one this town is already planning. And suddenly, Ethan realized Station 7 was no longer being restored. It was being reborn. The morning of the reopening arrived with clear skies over Pine Hollow Ridge. For the first time in years, Station 7's front doors stood wide open. Banners stretched across the brick facade. Hand-painted signs hung from nearby fences. People gathered early, filling the sidewalk, the parking lot, even the edges of Main Street. Ethan stood inside the truck bay, watching it all unfold. He still wasn't used to seeing the building this alive. Children ran across the concrete floor. Neighbors greeted each other like they had known one another forever. Smiles replaced the silence that once lived here. Evelyn adjusted flowers on a table near the entrance. Samuel Bishop checked the sound system. Graham Whitlock stood off to the side, arms crossed, quietly observing everything he had helped rebuild. None of it felt real, and yet it was. A small stage had been set up near the front bay doors. When the time came, Evelyn tapped the microphone twice. The crowd slowly quieted. Most of you know this building, she began. Her voice carried surprisingly well, but not all of you know its story. Ethan stayed near the back. He didn't like being the center of attention. He never had. Evelyn continued. This station was built on service, on sacrifice, on people who chose others before themselves. She paused. A soft breeze moved through the open doors. My husband, Walter Holloway, believed something very simple. Her eyes moved briefly toward Ethan. That a place can remember people, even when the world forgets them. The crowd listened in silence. He spent 18 years searching for a boy who had no reason to believe anyone was looking for him. Ethan's chest tightened, and he never stopped. Evelyn's voice softened. Because he believed that if he kept the door open long enough, the boy would eventually find his way home. She stepped aside. Today he did. All eyes slowly turned. Ethan froze. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't prepared anything to say. But people were waiting, watching, not judging, waiting. He stepped forward. The floor beneath him felt steady, stronger than it had ever been. I didn't know any of this, he said quietly. His voice barely carried at first, then stronger. I didn't know my parents. I didn't know this place. I didn't even know I was being searched for. He swallowed. But I knew what it felt like to have nothing. The crowd remained silent. And I know what it feels like to think nobody is coming. A pause. Then he looked around the station. At some point, I thought this was just a building I bought by accident. A faint, almost sad smile crossed his face. But it wasn't. His gaze landed on the photos of Nathan and Abigail displayed near the wall. It was a promise. Silence deepened. My parents died saving 14 children, he continued. and I used to think that meant I lost them too soon. He shook his head slightly. But now I understand. It also meant 14 families got to keep theirs. A few people lowered their heads, emotion spreading quietly through the crowd. Ethan exhaled. And Walter? His voice softened. He didn't just leave me a building, or money, or papers. He paused. He gave me a place where I could stop running. A long silence followed. Then Evelyn stepped forward and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. That's what home is, she said softly. It's where you stop running. The crowd began to applaud, slow at first, then steady. Not loud, not performative, just real. After the ceremony, the station became something else entirely. Tables filled the truck bay. Food appeared from nowhere. Laughter echoed against brick walls that had once held silence. Children ran through the open doors and back out again. People told stories, not just about Walter, but about their families, their losses, their survival. Station 7 became once again what it had always been meant to be, a place where people gathered when life got heavy. That evening, when the last visitors left and the sun began to drop behind the town, Ethan climbed the steel ladder to the roof. The sky was turning orange, then gold, then deep blue. The town stretched out below him, lights flickering on one by one. Evelyn was inside, putting away dishes. Samuel was locking up tools. Graham stood near his truck, talking quietly with someone from the neighborhood. For the first time, Ethan saw it clearly. This wasn't a project anymore. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't even a legacy. It was a home. He pulled out his wallet. Inside were 3 photographs. One of him as a child, one of Nathan and Abigail in their firefighter gear, and one of Station 7, now alive again. He placed them on the ledge beside him, letting the wind hold them in place. Then he leaned back on his hands and looked at the sky. For 18 years, he had been someone with no place to belong. A file in a system, a name on a paper, a boy waiting for something he couldn't name. Now, for the first time, he understood something simple. He hadn't found Station 7. It had found him. Below him, the station glowed with warm light. The doors remained open, and Pine Hollow Ridge, quietly and without ceremony, continued to breathe around it. Ethan Mercer was not forgotten. He never had been. He just hadn't known where to look. And now he didn't have to look anymore.